They erased her name from history, but the world kept running on her work. What they took from her wasn't credit, it was control. She worked in silence, fixing what others broke, while louder voices claimed the breakthroughs. After her death, the records thinned out, the names changed, and progress pretended she was never there. Years later, the cracks started to show. Her absence left fingerprints everywhere. This isn't a story about fame. It's about power, erasure, and the truth that refuses to stay buried. They told the world her story had ended, that the silence around her name was natural, that time had simply moved on. But silence is never empty. It's filled with decisions. And in 1917, on a rain-heavy night where even the streets seemed to listen, her life slipped quietly into history, unnoticed, unresolved, unfinished. The year was 1917. Europe was cracking under the weight of war. Empires groaned, borders trembled, and in a narrow room where lamplight barely reached the corners, she exhaled one final breath. No crowd, no headlines, no sense that something irreplaceable had just disappeared. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Inside, everything had ended. She had lived most of her life in the margins, not because she lacked talent, not because she lacked courage, but because history had already decided where she belonged. She was allowed to contribute, but never to claim, allowed to serve, but never to be seen. Her work traveled far beyond her name, carried by voices louder, faces safer, signatures deemed acceptable. The world would remember the achievements. It would forget the hands that shaped them. From an early age, she understood how power worked, not the kind written into law or stamped onto documents, but the quieter kind, the power of who is believed, who is credited, who is remembered when the story is told later by people who were never there. She learned quickly that brilliance alone was not enough. Her early years were marked by a restless curiosity, a hunger to understand patterns others overlooked. She saw connections where others saw noise. She listened when others spoke over one another. And when she worked with a precision that bordered on devotion. But devotion does not protect you in a world that has already decided you are replaceable. Doors opened just enough for her to step inside, then closed the moment she tried to stand fully in the light. Invitations came without acknowledgement. Praise was whispered, never printed. And when her ideas surfaced under someone else's name, she was told this was simply how things worked. That recognition was not the point. That contribution was its own reward. It was a lie told gently and repeated often. Still, she stayed, not because she was naive, but because leaving would have meant surrendering the work itself, and the work mattered more to her than the credit ever could. It was never about fame. It was about accuracy, truth, getting it right when the consequences of being wrong stretched far beyond personal pride. She lived in a constant state of almost being seen. Colleagues sought her insight privately, then spoke confidently in public as if the ideas had arrived fully formed in their own minds. Institutions relied on her precision, her discipline, her patience, yet refused to grant her permanence, authority, or voice. Her name became something that hovered, known but not spoken, respected but not cited, and slowly that erasure began to harden into routine. By the time war reshaped the continent, she had already learned how fragile a life's work could be. Papers misplaced, records lost, letters unanswered, decisions delayed until they no longer mattered. History doesn't always erase people violently. Sometimes it simply stops writing them down. As the world outside collapsed into chaos, her own battles remained invisible. She navigated scarcity, isolation, and the quiet exhaustion of knowing that her best years were being spent building something she might never be allowed to stand beside. Yet even then she refused to vanish. She kept working, kept correcting, kept noticing what others missed. Because if she stopped, the truth itself would suffer. In the final years, the recognition she deserved came in fragments, a mention here, a passing acknowledgement there, never enough to restore what had been taken, never enough to rewrite the narrative that had already settled into textbooks and public memory. When illness arrived, it did not come dramatically. It arrived the way neglect often does, slow, unremarkable, and easily dismissed. And when she died, the world did not pause. No institution held a moment of silence. No official record marked the loss properly. Her absence fit too neatly into a system already accustomed to overlooking her presence. If stories like this matter to you, stories that history tried to smooth over, you might want to stay close. Some names were lost on purpose, and remembering them changes how we see everything that came after. In the years following her death, others would stand on foundations she helped lay. They would speak with authority, publish with confidence, and accept praise without hesitation. Few would ask who had made their certainty possible. Fewer still would look for her name. But absence leaves fingerprints, and over time questions began to surface, small at first, then louder. Why did certain records feel incomplete? Why did certain breakthroughs seem to arrive without a clear origin? Why did the official story feel too clean, too simple, too convenient? The silence around her life began to crack, because forgetting someone does not erase their impact, it only delays the reckoning. And that reckoning, slow, uncomfortable, unavoidable, was already moving through history, inching closer to the truth she had carried alone for so long. What comes next is not about correcting a footnote, it's about confronting the cost of erasure. And once that door opens, it never closes quietly. History prefers clean lines, clear heroes, simple endings. Her life offered none of that. After her death, the machinery of remembrance did what it always does best. It simplified. Complex contributions were folded into broader narratives. Individual labor dissolved into collective progress. And in that process, her name became optional. At first, the omission felt accidental, a citation missing here, a reference shortened there, small gaps no one thought to question. But over time, the pattern hardened. Mentions of her work survived, detached from her identity, drifting through journals and lectures like orphaned ideas. What she had built remained. What she had been did not. Those who followed inherited the benefits of her precision without inheriting the burden of her struggle. They spoke confidently about systems she had refined, methods she had corrected, frameworks she had stabilized when no one else was paying attention. And because the results worked, no one asked who had made them work. In private correspondence, letters never meant for publication, her peers had once praised her clarity. They admitted reliance. They asked for guidance. They deferred to her judgment when the stakes were high. But public acknowledgement requires courage, and courage was expensive. Institutions feared complication more than injustice. To credit her fully would have meant questioning how recognition was distributed in the first place. It would have meant admitting that merit alone had never been the deciding factor. So they chose silence. Her belongings were sorted quickly, papers boxed without ceremony, notes filed under other names, personal correspondence discarded as irrelevant. The physical evidence of her thinking scattered, mislabeled, or quietly absorbed into archives where no one would think to look for her. This is how erasure becomes permanent, not through malice, but through convenience. Years passed. New generations entered the field, taught a version of history already stripped of her presence. They memorized dates, they repeated conclusions. They never learned to ask why certain voices were missing. And yet, something felt wrong. Certain problems seemed to have been solved too early, too elegantly, without sufficient explanation. Certain advancements appeared fully formed, without the messy trial and error that usually precedes real progress. Her absence created a subtle distortion. It was not obvious enough to provoke outrage, but it was persistent enough to trouble careful minds. Occasionally, someone would stumble across a footnote, a marginal comment, a reference to an assistant, a collaborator, a contributor whose name was omitted for brevity. Those moments rarely led anywhere. Archives are vast, and curiosity is often short-lived. But each rediscovery planted a quiet doubt. Who had really been doing the work? The world outside these questions was changing rapidly. Wars ended, new conflicts emerged, technology accelerated, attention spans shortened. There was little patience for revisiting old injustices that did not fit neatly into modern narratives. And still, her influence refused to disappear. Her methods persisted because they were sound. Her corrections endured because they were necessary. Even when stripped of attribution, her thinking shaped outcomes long after her name had faded. That is the irony of intellectual erasure. It cannot destroy the work, only detach it from the worker. But detachment has consequences. Without her voice in the record, later debates lacked context. Decisions were made without understanding why certain paths had been rejected, why particular compromises had been avoided. Mistakes resurfaced. Old errors repeated themselves, disguised as innovation. She had warned against many of them. Those warnings survived only indirectly, embedded in systems that assumed their own inevitability. In rare moments, someone would come close, a scholar noticing inconsistencies, a researcher questioning authorship, a historian tracing the lineage of ideas and finding a shadow where a figure should have been. But uncovering the truth required persistence, and persistence without institutional support is a lonely pursuit. She had known that loneliness well. There is a particular cruelty in being essential and invisible at the same time, in knowing that the world relies on your work while denying your existence. It fractures something fundamental, not just pride, but trust. Trust that effort will be rewarded, trust that truth will surface, trust that history is at least trying to be honest. She lost that trust slowly, not in a single moment of betrayal, but through years of watching others receive credit for conclusions she had fought to make accurate, through silence where acknowledgement should have been, through praise delivered second-hand, stripped of its source. And still, she did not stop. That persistence is what complicates her story. She was not a victim who vanished quietly. She was a contributor who continued despite the cost. someone who believed that the integrity of the work mattered more than the integrity of the system recognizing it. That belief sustained her and consumed her, because the system never changed. By the time historians began asking harder questions, too much time had passed. Witnesses were gone, records incomplete, institutional memory unreliable. The trail had gone cold not because it did not exist, but because no one had bothered to preserve it. History, once written, resists revision, and yet resistance does not make it correct. Her story sits in that uncomfortable space between acknowledgement and denial, not entirely forgotten, not fully remembered, suspended in a limbo reserved for those who mattered too much to erase completely and too inconvenient to celebrate. If you've ever wondered how many lives like hers exist beneath the surface of what we're taught, this is where the reckoning begins. Remembering her means questioning the structure that erased her, and that is never a comfortable exercise. Because once you see how easily a life like hers could be rewritten, you start to wonder what else has been quietly rearranged. And that question does not stay contained. It spreads. The first people to seriously question her disappearance from the record were not authorities. They were outsiders, the kind history rarely listens to at first. Independent researchers, archivists working after hours, graduate students chasing inconsistencies no one else had time for. People who noticed that certain breakthroughs arrived without a clear lineage, and that the same unnamed figure kept appearing in the margins. A handwritten note, an unsigned correction, a reference to her calculations with no name attached. At first, these fragments seemed meaningless, academic clutter, the residue of collaboration, but taken together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Someone had been there, consistently, decisively. And then, as often happens, the pattern was recognized and quietly discouraged. Because questions like these don't just threaten reputations, they threaten systems. If her contributions were fully acknowledged, it would force a re-examination of how authority had been assigned. It would raise uncomfortable questions about whose work is protected, whose is absorbed, and whose is allowed to vanish without consequence. Institutions do not like to reopen settled narratives, so the doubts were redirected, minimized, explained away as misunderstandings. She became a footnote again, but this time the footnote had witnesses. Those who pursued her trail began to encounter resistance. Archive access delayed, documents mysteriously unavailable, requests answered with vague references to lost records or incomplete collections. No one outright denied her existence, they simply made it impossible to prove it mattered. And yet, the work itself continued to speak. The systems she had shaped showed an internal consistency that did not match the official story of their development. Certain decisions made sense only if guided by someone deeply familiar with failures that had never been publicly recorded. She had learned through trial, through error, through corrections made quietly, without fanfare. Those lessons were embedded in the outcomes. One researcher described it as finding fingerprints without a body. The influence was undeniable, but the person behind it had been erased so thoroughly that even her absence felt intentional. That realization marked a turning point. This was no longer about restoring a forgotten name. It was about exposing a method of disappearance. because what happened to her was not unique. It was exemplary. She represented a class of contributors whose labor was considered useful, but whose visibility was considered dangerous. People whose inclusion would complicate the narrative of progress, forcing it to acknowledge that advancement often relies on voices it refuses to amplify. Once that framework became visible, her story took on new weight. She was no longer just someone history forgot. She was someone history chose not to remember. And choice implies responsibility. The scholars who continued digging understood the risk. Challenging entrenched narratives rarely leads to professional reward. Funding dries up. Careers stall. Invitations stop arriving. Still, some persisted. They began reconstructing her life from indirect evidence, cross-referencing timelines, comparing drafts, analyzing stylistic consistencies in writing attributed to others. The same precision, the same phrasing, the same disciplined restraint. Her voice, stripped of attribution, had a signature. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged, not complete, but unmistakable. She had been present at critical junctures, consulted privately, trusted implicitly, yet never granted formal authority. Her role was advisory, supportive, essential, and entirely deniable. When outcomes succeeded, others stood in the spotlight. When complications arose, her absence made blame diffuse. It was a perfect arrangement for those in power. For her, it meant a lifetime of proximity without recognition, influence without ownership, impact without legacy. What the researchers found most striking was not the scale of her contribution, but the consistency of her restraint. She rarely pushed for credit, rarely protested publicly. She seemed to understand early on that resistance would cost her access entirely, so she chose proximity over protest. That decision is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like compliance, weakness, acceptance. It was neither. It was strategy. She knew that being present, even invisibly, was the only way to protect the integrity of the work. That if she withdrew completely, the system she cared about would drift toward error, toward oversimplification, toward collapse. She stayed because someone had to, and she paid for that decision with her name. By the time the full implications of her erasure began to surface, she was long gone. There was no one left to correct the record herself, no letters demanding recognition, no public testimony. Only fragments. And fragments are easy to dismiss. Still, something had shifted. The silence around her no longer felt neutral. It felt constructed. And once you see construction, you start looking for the blueprint. That blueprint revealed itself slowly in hiring practices, citation norms, informal hierarchies, patterns that favored visibility over accuracy, confidence over competence, narratives that celebrated lone geniuses while quietly relying on uncredited labor. She had been trapped inside that blueprint. Understanding this did not bring immediate justice. Histories are not rewritten overnight. Institutions do not apologize easily. But it changed the questions being asked. Not why was she forgotten, but how was she erased? And more importantly, who benefits when stories are told this way? That question did not stay confined to her case. It began to spread outward, unsettling other narratives, prompting re-examinations, creating discomfort where certainty once lived. Her story became a lens, and through that lens, the past looked very different. Because remembering her is not about correcting a single omission. It is about recognizing a pattern that repeats itself whenever power feels threatened by truth. And once you recognize that pattern, you can't unsee it. Which is why the next chapter is the most dangerous one of all, not for her, but for the stories built on her silence. The danger was never in proving she existed. That much became unavoidable. The danger was in what her existence implied, because once her absence was understood as deliberate, the story stopped being about a single life and started becoming about an entire structure, one built carefully to reward familiarity over fairness, proximity over merit. And structures do not like to be exposed. The deeper investigators went, the more resistance hardened around them. Not loud resistance, not outrage, something colder, more professional. Funding proposals were rejected with polite language, archive requests stalled indefinitely, conference invitations quietly disappeared. It wasn't censorship in the dramatic sense, it was suffocation. The system didn't argue, it simply stopped responding. That silence mirrored the one she had lived inside for decades. What finally shifted the ground was not a single discovery, but a convergence. Multiple researchers, working independently, arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, different disciplines, different archives, different motivations. They compared notes, and the overlap was undeniable. Her handwriting appeared in margins across multiple collections. Her phrasing echoed through documents attributed to others. Her corrections, small, precise, unmistakable, appeared at moments where entire projects might have failed without them. She was not an assistant, she was a stabilizer, someone who stepped in when things threatened to collapse, someone trusted with the hardest problems and denied the easiest reward, recognition. The more clearly this role emerged, the more uncomfortable the silence around it became, because acknowledging her fully would require something radical, admitting that the official story had been wrong, not accidentally, but structurally. It would mean confronting how authority had been protected by erasure. That realization created a fracture. On one side were those who believed history should be corrected no matter the cost. On the other were those who argued that reopening the past served no practical purpose, that progress mattered more than precision. It was an old argument, and one she would have recognized instantly. She had lived her entire life inside that logic, the idea that moving forward justified leaving people behind, that efficiency mattered more than fairness, that the work mattered, but the worker was replaceable. What made this moment different was timing. The world had changed, audiences were more skeptical, power was less centralized, and stories of overlooked contributors were no longer treated as curiosities, they were treated as symptoms. Her story resonated because it felt familiar, too familiar. People recognized the pattern in their own lives, the meetings where their ideas were echoed later by louder voices, the projects where they did the work while someone else took the credit, the exhaustion of being necessary but never acknowledged. She became a mirror, and mirrors make people uncomfortable. Institutions responded the way they always do when confronted with discomfort. They reframed. They acknowledged her influence without conceding authorship. They praised her supportive role without assigning responsibility. They offered symbolic gestures instead of structural change. A line in a report. A mention in a footnote. A carefully worded panel discussion. It was not nothing, but it was not enough. Because the issue was never visibility alone, it was ownership. Who owns an idea when the person who shaped it was never allowed to claim it? Who carries responsibility when success and failure are separated from contribution? These questions could not be answered cleanly, and that was the problem. Her story refused to stay tidy. As debates intensified, so did the pushback. Critics accused researchers of revisionism, of projecting modern values onto the past, of destabilizing narratives that had already been settled. But settled for whom? Not for her. Not for those like her. The closer the truth came to the surface, the clearer it became why she had never fought publicly, why she had chosen silence over confrontation. She understood something deeply pragmatic, that systems rarely change because of moral arguments. They change only when their contradictions become impossible to ignore. And that moment had finally arrived. The recognition she never sought in life was beginning to take shape after her death, not as praise, but as disruption. That disruption came at a cost. Some careers stalled, some reputations dimmed. Some institutions quietly revised internal documents while publicly insisting nothing had changed. But the questions remained. And questions are harder to bury than people. If this story is making you uncomfortable, that's not an accident. Stories like hers aren't meant to inspire, they're meant to disturb. If you want to keep following where this leads, stay with it. The most revealing part is still ahead. Because there was one final piece no one expected to find. Not a letter, not a journal, but a decision. Late in her life, long after she understood she would never be credited properly, she made a choice that reframed everything that came before it. A quiet, deliberate act that explained her restraint, her patience, her refusal to demand recognition. She had prepared for erasure. She had known it was coming, and instead of resisting it, she had planned around it, leaving behind a trail subtle enough to survive suppression, but clear enough to be followed by those willing to look closely. Not instructions, not confessions, signals. That realization changed how her entire life was interpreted. She was not passive, she was strategic. And the implications of that strategy would force history to confront something far more unsettling than a forgotten name. It would have to confront intent. Because if her disappearance from the record was not merely something done to her, but something she anticipated and shaped, then the narrative collapses entirely. She was not erased. She outmaneuvered the erasure. And understanding how and why requires stepping into the final stretch of her story, where silence becomes deliberate, absence becomes language, and the truth reveals itself not through what was written, but through what was left behind. What she left behind was not a confession, it was a structure. At first, the researchers didn't recognize it as such. They were still thinking in terms of documents, letters, drafts, diaries, tangible proof, something that could be cited, cataloged, and presented cleanly. But her thinking had never been clean. It had been precise. The pattern revealed itself only when they stopped looking for her voice and started tracing her logic. Across different institutions and unrelated archives, decisions appeared that mirrored one another too closely to be coincidence. Safeguards built into systems where none were expected, redundancies that protected against errors no one else had publicly acknowledged. She had encoded her presence into outcomes. Even stripped of attribution, her influence remained traceable through the way certain problems had been anticipated long before they became visible. She had not just contributed to the work, she had future-proofed it. That realization reframed everything. Her silence was not resignation, it was insulation. She had understood that recognition could be revoked, distorted, or denied, but structures, if designed carefully, could outlast the politics that surrounded them. So she built in ways that made her absence irrelevant to the survival of the truth. This was not martyrdom, it was refusal. A refusal to let the work decay simply because she would not be remembered. A refusal to trade long-term integrity for short-term acknowledgement. A refusal to center herself when the stakes were larger than any one life. Seen through this lens, her restraint became something else entirely. She had been playing a longer game. The choice came late in her life, when the pattern of erasure was no longer theoretical. By then, she had watched others rise using foundations she had reinforced. She had watched institutions benefit from her corrections while denying her authority. She knew the record would never favor her, and so she adjusted her strategy. Instead of pushing her name forward, she embedded her thinking so deeply into the system that removing it would cause failure. She made herself indispensable in a way that did not rely on visibility. It was a dangerous approach, one that required absolute confidence in the value of the work itself. And it worked. Long after her death, when questions finally arose, they could not be answered without encountering her logic. Her decisions shaped entire trajectories. Her caution prevented disasters no one ever knew had been avoided. She had built a silent legacy. The tragedy is not that she went unrecognized in life, it's that recognition was never the point. She understood something few do, that credit is fragile, but consequence is durable. That understanding came at a personal cost: isolation, fatigue, the knowledge that history might never catch up, that her name could vanish entirely while her work carried on without her. That is not a romantic sacrifice. It is a heavy one. The people uncovering her story struggled with this. They wanted a moment of vindication, a revelation that would restore balance, a final acknowledgement that would make the injustice feel resolved. But her story refused that shape. There was no moment where everything snapped into place, no official declaration that corrected the record cleanly, only a growing awareness that the past had been built on quieter labor than anyone wanted to admit. And that awareness changed how people read the record. They began to see her absence not as emptiness, but as design, a negative space that carried intention, a silence that meant something. That insight unsettled a deeper assumption, that recognition is the ultimate measure of contribution. Her life challenged that assumption directly. She mattered not because she was remembered, but because what she built endured, because the systems she shaped continued to function, because the truth she protected survived even when her name did not. That does not make the erasure acceptable. It makes it more complex. Because now the injustice cannot be resolved simply by adding her name to a list. Doing so would miss the point. It would domesticate a story that is fundamentally about resistance. If you've stayed with this story, it's likely because you recognize that tension, the pull between wanting justice and realizing that justice, in this case, does not arrive neatly. If this kind of quiet defiance matters to you, if you believe some legacies speak louder through absence than applause, this is a moment to stay close. Not everything worth protecting announces itself. As her story spread, it forced a reevaluation of how history measures success, how it assigns authorship, how it defines importance. And in doing so, it revealed a final truth, one that makes her story deeply unsettling. The systems she built were designed to function without her, but they were also designed to expose their own contradictions over time. She knew that eventually someone would notice, that the integrity embedded in her work would clash with the stories told about it, that the silence around her would grow too heavy to ignore. She did not need to be remembered to be proven right. That was her final act of resistance. Not demanding acknowledgement, not leaving a manifesto, but trusting that truth, if built carefully enough, would survive even the most determined forgetting. And once that truth surfaced, it would not point back to her with certainty, it would point forward, forcing the world to ask harder questions about who gets erased and why. Those questions are where her story truly ends, and where its consequences begin. In the end, history did not correct itself. It hesitated. There was no official reckoning, no sweeping apology issued in polished language, no single moment where the record was declared flawed and rewritten with confidence. What happened instead was slower and far more honest. People began reading differently. They stopped accepting clean narratives at face value. They started asking where certainty came from and who had paid for it. They learned to notice the gaps, not as accidents, but as signals. Her story did not return as a headline. It returned as a pressure that made familiar accounts feel incomplete, a pressure that unsettled conclusions once treated as final, a pressure that forced careful readers to acknowledge that progress, as it had been told, rested on more invisible labor than anyone wanted to admit. She became part of that pressure, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, but as a question that refused to go away. What does it mean to matter if no one remembers your name? What does justice look like when recognition arrives too late to be received? For some, these questions were uncomfortable enough to avoid. For others, they became impossible to ignore. Her legacy settled into that second category. The system she shaped continued to function, but now with an added weight, the knowledge that they had been built under conditions of exclusion, that they carried within them the intelligence of someone denied authority, that their success depended on a voice history had tried to mute. That knowledge did not break the systems, it complicated them, and complication is where real understanding begins. There were attempts to tidy the story, to reframe her as a product of her time, to contextualize the injustice until it felt inevitable, almost natural. These efforts were familiar, and she would have recognized them immediately. Context can explain harm, it cannot excuse it. What endured instead was a quieter shift. Educators began teaching uncertainty alongside achievement. Scholars cited absence as deliberately as presence. Readers learned to approach history not as a completed monument, but as an active negotiation between power and truth. In that negotiation, her life mattered deeply, not because it could be fully recovered, but because it revealed the cost of pretending nothing was missing. Her story did not end with vindication. It ended with responsibility. Responsibility passed to those who encountered it, to read more carefully, to credit more honestly, to question narratives that feel too smooth to be true, and perhaps most importantly, to recognize that silence is not neutral. She had lived inside silence long enough to understand its mechanics, how it can protect those in power, how it can erase without destroying, how it can turn contribution into anonymity without ever denying it existed. She understood all of this, and still she chose to build. That choice is the quiet power at the center of her life, not endurance, not sacrifice, but clarity, a clear-eyed understanding of the system she inhabited, and a refusal to let that system degrade the work itself. She did not believe the world would suddenly become fair. She believed the truth could still be preserved. And it was. Not intact, not untouched, but alive. If you've listened this far, it's because something in this story resonates beyond history, because you've seen versions of this play out in rooms you've stood in, projects you've contributed to, ideas you've watched drift away from their origins. Stories like hers are not warnings, they are mirrors. And mirrors ask something of us. They ask whether we will continue to reward visibility over substance, whether we will confuse confidence with competence, whether we will accept narratives that feel good instead of ones that feel true. They ask whether we are willing to notice who is missing. If this story has held you, if it's made you pause or question or feel the weight of what goes unrecorded, stay with work like this. Remembering isn't passive, it's an act, and it changes what comes next. Her name may never sit comfortably in the places it should have occupied, but her influence remains, woven into outcomes that refuse to unravel. That is not a consolation prize. It is a challenge to tell better stories, to build fairer systems, to listen for the silences that still shape our world, because the past is not fixed, it is interpreted, and how we interpret it determines whether lives like hers remain cautionary tales or become turning points. She was never asking to be celebrated. She was asking, quietly, persistently, for the work to be done right. And now, that responsibility belongs to us.